Okay, good to have you back again. Yesterday, after talking about consideration of local culture and customs and all of that, uh, being sensitive to what people feel in other countries where we're working, realizing that we're there for them, they are not there for us. Um, all of that sort of gives us an outlook on life that maybe is a little bit different than your typical American. We Americans like to pride ourselves on we're independent. We'll do what we want to do. We don't worry about what others think. That may be okay up here. It will not be okay in many other cultures. Uh, we pride ourselves on that, and I guess there's nothing wrong with that in American culture. That's the way we are. But you get to other cultures, and they have a different way of looking at things. They have that many times that concept we shouldn't be rocking the boat, you shouldn't be causing problems, you should be fitting in, things of that nature. That's just typical around the world. It's more an idea of living in community rather than living individually. The Japanese have a saying, the nail that sticks up is going to get hammered down. You stand out, you're allowed to get clobbered in a lot of places because that's not a value that's appreciated or cultivated or thought highly of or anything of that nature. So when we go into another culture, another country, another place, even if that's within our own country, we ought to be sensitive to those local customs and values and things of that nature. We ought to try to fit in. We are, as I said, citizens of heaven and not necessarily representatives of a particular country or even a particular region of a country. Now, I'm not suggesting at any moment that we sacrifice our basic values and principles. That's not the issue here. The issue is, are we sensitive to what matters to them and what is important in their culture, their lives, or not? Do we try to be all things to all people that we might by any means win a few? And so, with that foundation from yesterday, today I want to get down to some of the nitty gritty of how to do that. How do we make those decisions? Where do we draw the line? So, what can we do when it comes to all these different things about fitting in and adapting to the local culture and accepting their values and then applying them into our own lives? Now, I mentioned when we were out in the jungle, the women out in the jungle didn't use makeup. Wearing a bra was not common back then. They couldn't afford it. It just wasn't culturally something that they did at that time. It's since become quite acceptable, common. Even the norm down there is well up here for women to dress very much in what we would consider a Western or an American fashion. Back then it wasn't. So every culture changes as time goes by. If you're in any country for a very long time, if you're in any section of this country for a very long time, you guys haven't been around long enough to do that yet. I have. You see how things change. I'm always fascinated when styles come out and they say, oh, the latest style. And I say, well, that's like what they did back in the 50s or 60s or something like that. So styles do kind of go around and come around. There's sort of a tendency to ebb and flow and all that. And that's great. Life isn't stagnant. It wasn't intended to be. So how do we make those decisions? Well, a lot of Christians, especially ones that tend to be conservative as far as their biblical values, and I tend to be that way, would go the Bible and they would read a verse like what we have in 1 Timothy, where he says, likewise, that the women also should adorn themselves in a respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with fancy braids or gold or pearls or costly attire, but that which is proper for women who profess godliness with godly works. So there Paul's saying, okay, don't be excessive. Now, there's all sorts of interpretations and applications of that. If we go to the very conservative Mennonite or the Amish communities, well, they have, their bonnets and everything else, and they've codified whatever modesty was at a particular period in history, and they said, okay, this is it. It can't change. And so to a certain degree, they've tried to keep that constant throughout a significant period of time. People use them as a tourist attraction today. They drive down and say, wow, look at those people, how they dress. Look at those people. They're strange, weird, all that. They see them like a museum piece. We got to go back in time and see what life was like 100 years ago or so or whatever. I don't think that's the point for us as Christians. We're not to become museum pieces. We're to be part of living, breathing society. And the reason for that, that's the only way we can interact successfully with society. That's the only way that we can evangelize and share the gospel with others. If they see us as something weird, as something strange, as something out of a museum, they might gawk at us, but they're not going to be saying, hey, I want to be like those people. You don't see people flocking to the Amish community to become members. In fact, if anything, the Amish community is constantly hemorrhaging members, as so many of their young people find the draws and attractions of society around them just too great, and they're not able to pull apart. Now, I'll tell you a little bit of story, then I want a little bit of a story again, then I want to get into this whole concept of what is modesty, what is proper dress, what is avoiding expensive apparel. So the story I'll tell you is about my wife. When we were in Colombia, she had made for herself and taken a couple of things down there, did a lot of sewing back then because clothes were expensive and not readily available, and my wife liked to sew. So she made a lot of her own clothing, and sometimes mine, and most of the clothing our children wore back in those days. She had made herself a couple of sundresses. I mean, we were in the hot tropical climate. A sundress is a natural, right? Well, a sundress, as you know, has little straps up here in your shoulders and arms are bare and all. That's cool. They're comfortable, all that kind of thing in hot climates. She started wearing those in Colombia. We'd go out shopping or something. We kind of noticed, or she noticed, she was getting a lot of remarks that weren't always the nicest. And she just thought, well, I'm an American, I'm light-skinned, I'm kind of used to that. But the sundresses seemed to accentuate it. She had worn them a few times, and one of the ladies from the church happened to stop by the house, and Jeannie was wearing one. And this lady walked in and a little polite chit-chat for a little while. Then she kind of reached out and rubbed her shoulder and says, oh, these are cool and comfortable in your house, but you would never go outside wearing something like this, would you? Well, my wife picked up pretty quickly something was going on there. She was a very observant person, as we all should be, by the way. And she noticed right away in the way this lady was talking, something was going on. So she asked, which is what you do. She was curious. What do you mean by that? Well, you're showing your shoulder. Showing my shoulder? Yeah, look, you can see it. If you know anything about Latin culture, Latin culture has always been famous for very, very low-cut blouses. They tend to be fairly full-figured and, a lot of cleavage to show there, and they do. They don't see that as a problem. That's normal in their culture. That's natural in their culture. It's practical. Most of the time they'd wind up starting to have kids, and traditionally pretty young, 16, 17, 18, something like that. Now it's moved up a ways, but that's what it was traditionally. They'd marry them off at 15, at quinceañera from Latin America. They'd come of age and just almost immediately marry them off. And so they were nursing, breastfeeding, and it was simply practical and made it easy and convenient to do. So that was no problem. But in Latin culture, you didn't show your shoulders. That was improper. That was indecent. That was not done. And so once my wife figured that out, she made sure she didn't go outside wearing sundresses anymore. In fact, she kind of used them around the house till they wore out, and, as house dresses, and then didn't make any more, didn't wear them anymore, because it wasn't proper in that culture. Now, we laugh at that and say, well, what's wrong with showing your shoulders? In our culture, nothing. But in Latin culture, it was. That was a part of the body you didn't expose. So every culture develops its sense of what's right and of what's wrong, what can be exposed and what shouldn't be exposed. And that's different, and that's okay. So if something is all right in a culture, it's okay for you as a Christian person, man or woman, to do it. If something is considered improper in a culture and you're there trying to win them to the gospel, you're trying to share the good news, then whatever that is improper for you as well. Now, if you think, well, that's strange the way these Latin Americans do things. How in the world could you think a shoulder is indecent? Now, today, by the way, that's changed, and you'll see women wearing sundresses and shorts and things like that, stuff that never would have happened, 30, 40 years ago. So Colombia has changed. It's become much more westernized, much more Americanized, as so many people have come up here to the States to live and work for a while, and maybe going back, or they visit relatives up here, something of that nature, and they buy clothing and take it back, and they say, well, Americans do it, must be okay, we'll do it. So that's changed, but back then, that was the culture. So whatever the culture is, where you are at that moment, that's what you should sort of be tuned into. We shouldn't go to the extreme of being seen as being immodest or improper in our dress. We shouldn't go to the extreme as being museum pieces either. Both of those extremes would be wrong, because both of those extremes would make it so we could not then be effectively sharing the gospel. Now, if you think that's strange in Latin American and culture and all that, let me bring out a point that'll maybe make it a little bit more clear. Any of you ever read the Little House books by Laura Ingalls Wilder? Those are pretty common for kids still. They're written back in the 1800s, but they're common because they talk about Laura Ingalls Wilder and her life growing up as a little girl on the American frontier. You know, the little house in the big woods, the little house on the prairie, you know, the little house on Plum Creek, you know, all those different ones that she wrote. And she'd take a little period in their life when they were living in an area, and she'd talk about just everyday things. And people are fascinated by that still. Well, when she writes that Little House on the Prairie book, she's a teenager, and then moving up to the age where she gets married then eventually. So she's this teenager, and she goes into town one day, and doing whatever they're going to do. They live on a farm outside the town, and they go in this little town, Wilmot, North Dakota, South Dakota, one of the Dakotas out there, I think. And as they're into town, some woman comes riding into town on a horse. Well, that wasn't common because women usually rode in buggies because they could do it with more decorum there. Well, this lady comes riding in on a horse. And as she's riding in on a horse, she's riding side saddle, but still she's on this horse. And you know what? She was doing it in such a way that people could see her ankles. And oh, that was a scandal in this town. People saw this woman's ankles. Well, I would probably venture to guess, if I would look around, if I had you all in a classroom, I'd look around, I'd probably see almost all the girls' ankles. Maybe if you're wearing pants and socks, probably not. But we don't get too worked up about seeing ankles today, do we? No. But back then they did, because back then a woman didn't show her ankles. Now, that's perfectly normal. So in America, times changed again from the Laura Ingalls Wilder's book. Once she got a new haircut, I think she'd cut bangs and pulled her hair back like in a bun, and her ears were showing, and that scandalized her mother. She's showing her ears. She's letting men see her ears. Again today, we go, huh? What? But that's culture as it changes. Now that shows you how it's changed from the 1800s in America to today. Now that's happened over a period of time, little by little. But every time a new style comes out that maybe exposes something that isn't traditionally exposed, that's often seen as scandalous. I think we as Christians probably shouldn't be on the cutting edge of styles. But as I mentioned, we shouldn't be way, way back either. Today somebody walk around saying, man, women can't show their ankles, women can't show their ears, that's immodest. People would go, this guy's strange, he's, screwed loose somewhere in there. But back in the 1800s, that would have probably been something you would have heard in a lot of pulpits, I would imagine. Or in a lot of youth groups as they were trying to teach the young girls how to be proper ladies. So we have to go into a culture, and we have to start looking, and we have to start evaluating, and we have to start asking, what's proper there? What's okay there? What is within this acceptable parameters, up and down? And once we sort of figure that out, then we should fit somewhere kind of in the middle. We don't want to be rocking the boat. We don't want to be that nail that's sticking up that's going to get hammered down. We don't want to be so old and frumpy that people laugh at us and smirk and see us as a museum piece or as a tourist attraction when they go by. But yet within those two parameters, there's an awful lot of room where we can work, where we can act, where we can be careful. Now, I've focused on dress because that's where we first see it, and that's where it's probably the most obvious to it. It's probably more common with women than men. Men typically don't have that much difference in dress, at least within a culture or society. I suppose we go back to somewhere men wear loincloths or something. That would be different to us, a Tarzan look or something. But most places now dress is somewhat Western. And within the culture, men generally don't have that much variation within style, typically. So it's more of a problem, more of an issue for the women than it typically is for men, but men too. Maybe, say, long hair at different times in our society has either been the normal or the weird abnormal. Beards too, sometimes for men are seen that way. There for a while, boy, nobody have a beard, that was hillbilly. Now we still kind of joke about it being redneck and stuff, but we do it. And so within what's the acceptable norm, it's acceptable for us. Remember, we're citizens of heaven, not of this earth. We're here in this earth as a sojourner for a period of time. Now, what's a sojourner do? They're there. They're passing through. They want to be able to be accommodated and to accommodate within that culture so that they can survive, so that they can get along. Stranger shows up and gets too far out of what's normal for that area, they're going to wind up in jail or expelled or ostracized or something, and that's what we generally want to avoid. Now, that being the case with dress, if anybody has any specific questions on that in the post, you can ask me and I'll give you an opinion on it. Might not be a very good one, but I'll give you an opinion. And we can talk about that. But cultures and customs are something we observe, we pay attention to, and we adapt to wherever we are if we want to be emissaries of the gospel and sharers of the good news. With that in mind, now I want to get to these mannerisms that we use. Everybody has mannerisms. We all do certain things without thinking about it. Now, I've already mentioned the one that you just simply don't do in Latin America, that it's okay sign where we put our index finger on our thumb, and kind of make an O, and I guess the three fingers sticking up are like the K or something, I don't know. But that's so common here, we just almost do it, all of us, without thinking. Yet in Latin America, that's an extremely vulgar one, as I mentioned. It's kind of like the female version of giving somebody the finger in American culture. Now, in Latin culture, that was never done, but today, they see it so much in movies, they're starting to use that as a vulgar sign as well. So I guess now they're equal opportunity vulgarity promoters or something, using both of them. So I warn any of our preachers going down to be very careful not to do that. And even after I've warned them, I have to remind them if they're going to speak again somewhere, because almost invariably they do without thinking. But when one of them does it, you can sort of feel this like shock go through the audience as they see it. Other things you do, and I'll point some of them out just as examples and tell you to be observant how they do things when they're doing something, and then ask why if you doubt. In Colombia, for example, you always say a child is this tall. You put your hand up like this. That's kind of like putting your hand on the child's head, I guess it is. A cute little kid here like that. You always say a person is this tall. If you're talking about an animal, you'll say it's this tall. When they measure horses, they say how many hands high, because you measure a horse, or used to anyhow, by taking your hands like this and counting. So they do that in Latin America as well. And so if you go like that to say something, a kid is this tall or something, my kids are this tall, everybody laugh. They'll say, oh, do they have four paws? Do they have a tail? Because you're saying my kids are animals. Well, maybe they are, but that's probably not what you're trying to indicate. So something as simple as that, and people do it all the time. In Spanish culture, it typically was not polite to point. You just simply didn't point. Because that was considered vulgar. Again, they saw it as sort of a representation of the male genitalia. And so you didn't stick your finger out and point at something. Well, you'll say, well, then how did you indicate anything? Well, you kind of use your mouth and your lips and your eyes. You'll over there, kind of pucker up and look at it. Look at that over there. Well, we'd laugh at that, but that's the way they do it down there. And they would laugh or be embarrassed if they see the way we point or indicate at things. So when you're looking at stuff like that, pay attention and adapt and ask questions. Be curious and say why. Okay, that's it. We're running out of time. We'll talk some more tomorrow.